May 11th, 1945, 07:45 hours, 80 miles north of Okinawa. Radar Picket Station Number 15. Lieutenant Commander Baron Joseph Mullaney stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley, watching the green glow of the radar scope. His ship had been on station for 6 hours, serving as an early warning outpost for the main fleet operating near Okinawa. The job was simple in theory. Detect incoming Japanese aircraft and vector-friendly fighters to intercept them before they could reach the carriers and battleships. In practice, it was the most dangerous assignment in the United States Navy. Mullaney knew the statistics. In the past month, 14 destroyers on radar picket duty had been sunk or damaged beyond repair by kamikaze attacks. Another 23 had taken serious damage. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at these isolated picket ships, and the mathematics were brutally simple. A destroyer carried perhaps 200 sailors. A kamikaze aircraft carried 1 pilot willing to die. If the trade was 1 plane for 1 ship, Japan would gladly make that exchange 1,000 times. The radar operator called out a contact, 45 miles north, bearing 350 degrees, multiple bogies. Mullaney picked up the radio handset and reported the contact to the Combat Air Patrol. 4 Marine Corsairs were already en route to intercept. But then the radar operator's voice changed. "Sir, I've got multiple contacts, dozens of them, coming from every direction." Mullaney looked at the scope. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The screen was filling with radar returns. North, northeast, east, separate groups, all converging on Picket Station 15. He counted the contacts quickly. More than 50 aircraft. Probably more than 100. This wasn't a probe or a harassing attack. This was a coordinated mass strike designed to overwhelm the picket ships through sheer numbers. He called down to the fire control director. "Load proximity fuses, all guns, this is going to get bad." What Lieutenant Commander Mullaney did not know was that his ship was carrying the most advanced anti-aircraft ammunition in the world. The 5-inch shells being loaded into Hadley's guns contained miniature radar sets that would detonate automatically when they came within 70 feet of an aircraft. The Japanese pilots diving toward his ship had no idea they were flying into a technological barrier their own scientists had declared impossible to build, and what the German engineers who had examined these same fuses 6 months earlier and dismissed them as defective did not know was that their conclusion would help kill thousands of their Japanese allies who never learned what weapon was destroying their aircraft with such devastating efficiency. This is the story of how American industry created a weapon that violated every assumption about what was possible, how that weapon was kept secret even after enemies captured, working examples, and how it killed more than 40 aircraft in a single engagement, using fewer than 200 shells, fundamentally changing the nature of naval warfare. Forever, the problem had started 4 years earlier, thousands of miles away, in a completely different ocean, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the anti-aircraft guns defending the naval base, fired thousands of shells at attacking Japanese aircraft that morning. The gunners used time-fused ammunition, shells set to explode at specific altitudes based on estimates of how high the enemy planes were flying and how fast they were moving. The system failed catastrophically. Most shells exploded too high or too low. Some detonated on impact with the ground in downtown Honolulu, killing American civilians. The few shells that did explode near enemy aircraft rarely did any damage because the fragments dispersed in all directions and a plane had to be very close to the detonation point to be hit by enough shrapnel to bring it down. The statistics from that morning were grim. American anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of rounds and shot down almost nothing. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft during the entire attack, and most were brought down by Army Air Corps fighters, not by anti-aircraft fire. Ensign John Charles England was serving aboard the battleship USS Oklahoma that morning. He was in charge of damage control teams responsible for keeping the ship afloat if she took hits. When Japanese torpedo bombers appeared overhead at 0758, Oklahoma's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire with everything they had. England stood on the deck, coordinating his teams, while 5-inch shells screamed overhead. The gunners were setting their time fuses for altitudes between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. The Japanese torpedo bombers were attacking at 1,500 feet. Every shell exploded harmlessly above the targets. The first torpedo hit Oklahoma's port side at 0800, then the second, then the third. The battleship began listing to port as water poured through the torpedo holes. England sent men below to close watertight doors and seal off flooding compartments. The list increased 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Men started sliding across the tilted deck. England kept working. He helped trapped sailors climb through hatches as the ship rolled. He made multiple trips into flooding compartments to pull men out. At 0810, Oklahoma capsized completely. England went down with the ship, still trying to save his men. He drowned, along with 414 other sailors. If the anti-aircraft guns had been effective, some of those torpedo bombers might have been destroyed before they could launch their weapons. But time-fused shells couldn't hit fast-moving aircraft reliably, and England died because the technology didn't exist to protect his ship. The United States Navy understood they had a critical problem. Modern aircraft were too fast and too maneuverable for time fuses to work effectively. What they needed was a shell that would explode automatically when it came close to an enemy plane. A proximity fuse. The concept wasn't new. Engineers in multiple countries had been proposing proximity fuses since the 1920s. The theoretical principle was straightforward. Put some kind of sensor in the nose of an artillery shell that could detect when the shell was near a target and trigger the detonator automatically. But the engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. An artillery shell fired from a 5-inch naval gun experienced forces that would destroy any conventional electronics instantly. When fired, the shell accelerated from 0 to 2,800 feet per second in the length of the gun barrel. That created a setback force of 20,000 times the force of gravity, 20,000 G-forces, sustained for 3/1,000ths of a second. Simultaneously, the rifling grooves in the gun barrel spun the shell at 25,000 revolutions per minute to stabilize its flight. Any electronic components inside the shell would be subjected to crushing acceleration and violent rotation that would pulverize ordinary vacuum tubes into glass powder and twisted metal. Then there were the practical requirements. The fuse needed to be small enough to fit inside a standard 5-inch shell. It needed to be reliable enough for mass production. It needed safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation that could kill friendly gun crews. It needed to be weatherproof, stable in storage for months, and cheap enough to manufacture by the millions. It needed to work in rain, in fog, at night, in tropical heat and Arctic cold. And it needed to be simple enough that ordinary sailors could handle it safely without specialized training. German scientists had been working on proximity fuses since the early 1930s. By 1944, they had explored more than 30 different designs, including acoustic fuses triggered by engine sounds, electrostatic field detection, and radio frequency systems. None worked reliably in artillery shells. In 1943, after years of research, German engineers reached a definitive conclusion: building a vacuum tube-based radio fuse that could survive artillery gun firing was technologically impossible. The acceleration forces would destroy the tubes before the shell even left the barrel. The problem could not be solved with existing technology. British scientists had reached a different conclusion, but only barely. Researchers at Pi Limited began developing ruggedized vacuum tubes in 1939 that could withstand high acceleration. By 1940, they had working prototypes for rockets, which experienced much gentler acceleration than artillery shells. But every attempt to adapt British fuses for high-velocity artillery failed. The tubes shattered. The circuits failed. The fuses were unreliable. In August 1940, a British technical mission, led by Henry Tizard, arrived in the United States, carrying Britain's most secret military technologies. Among them were circuit diagrams and prototypes of British proximity fuse designs. The British hoped American industry could solve the manufacturing problems they couldn't overcome alone. The National Defense Research Committee assigned the project to Section T of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. Section T was led by Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist who had helped develop the theoretical foundations for radar in the 1920s. Tuve understood immediately that the core challenge wasn't the concept, but the execution. Radio proximity fuses were conceptually simple. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves. When those waves reflected off a nearby target, a receiver circuit would detect the reflected signal and trigger a detonator. Simple concept, extraordinarily difficult engineering. Tuve assembled a team of physicists and engineers and gave them an impossible deadline. The Navy needed working proximity fuses for 5-inch anti-aircraft guns as soon as humanly possible. Japanese air power was destroying American ships in the Pacific. Without an effective anti-aircraft defense, the Navy couldn't operate safely. Tuve's team had months, not years, to solve problems that had stumped British and German scientists for more than a decade. The first breakthrough came from Lloyd Berkner, one of Tuve's engineers. Berkner developed a system using separate transmitter and receiver circuits instead of a combined transceiver. This simplified the electronics and made the system more reliable, but the vacuum tube problem remained unsolved. Standard vacuum tubes shattered under the acceleration forces of gunfire. The glass envelopes cracked, the filaments broke, the tube elements came loose and destroyed the circuits. The solution came from an unexpected source: hearing aid manufacturers. Western Electric Company and Raytheon manufactured miniature vacuum tubes for hearing aids. These tubes were already ruggedized for portable use, small, mechanically robust, and used relatively little power. Working with Tuve's specifications, engineers at Western Electric and Raytheon modified hearing aid tube designs to survive artillery gun firing. They reinforced the glass envelopes. They redesigned the filament mounts, using shorter, thicker wires that could withstand shock. They tested the tubes by firing them from air cannons into solid blocks of wood, subjecting them to acceleration forces far exceeding what they would experience in combat. Most tubes failed. The engineers redesigned them, tested again, failed again, redesigned again. By January 1942, after months of iterative testing and redesign, they had vacuum tubes that could survive 20,000 G-forces and 25,000 RPM spin rates. The tubes were tiny, barely larger than a rifle cartridge. Each proximity fuse required 5 of these miniature tubes, along with resistors, capacitors, a battery, a safety mechanism, and a detonator. Everything had to fit into a space smaller than a beer can and weigh less than 2 pounds. The battery system alone presented enormous challenges. Standard batteries couldn't withstand the firing shock. Engineers developed a reserve battery that was activated by the setback force of firing itself. A small glass ampule containing electrolyte would shatter when the shell was fired, activating the battery only after the shell had left the gun. This solved 2 problems simultaneously. It prevented the battery from degrading during storage, and it created a critical safety feature. Unfired shells remained completely inert. The safety mechanisms required equally innovative solutions. The fuse needed to remain completely safe during handling, transportation, and loading. It couldn't arm until the shell had traveled far enough from the gun to protect friendly forces. Engineers designed a complex system using mercury switches that required centrifugal force from the shell's rotation to close, combined with a timer that ensured at least 0.3 of a second elapsed after firing before the fuse could detonate. This meant the shell had to travel at least 750 feet from the gun before it became active. Even if a shell misfired and fell near the gun crew, it would remain harmless. In early August 1942, the Navy conducted the first live fire test in Chesapeake Bay. The cruiser USS Cleveland fired at radio-controlled drone aircraft on August 12th during its shakedown cruise. The test was scheduled for 2 days. It ended after 1 day because all the drones were destroyed. Gun crews aboard Cleveland fired 4 shells. 3 drones were destroyed. Navy observers present at the test were astonished. The proximity fuses worked perfectly. For the first time in history, anti-aircraft gunners could reliably hit moving aerial targets without direct hits. The shells just needed to pass within 70 feet of the target, and the proximity fuse would detonate automatically, shredding the target with shrapnel. But successful testing and combat deployment were very different things. Tuve's team needed to scale up from prototype production to mass manufacturing. By January 1943, Section T had been reorganized as the Applied Physics Laboratory under Johns Hopkins University, with Tuve as director. The project now involved 26 contractors and 10,000 workers. More than 100 American companies contributed to proximity fuse production, including General Electric, RCA, Raytheon, Sylvania, Westinghouse, Eastman Kodak, Zenith, and even Wurlitzer, the organ manufacturer. Each proximity fuse contained 130 miniaturized electronic components. Assembly required precision work. Workers at factories across America built these fuses without knowing what they were building. Security was absolute. The project had the same classification level as the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. Workers who asked what the fuses were for were told only that they were critical to winning the war. Many workers never learned the truth until after the war ended. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati became one of the largest proximity fuse manufacturers, producing 5.2 million units, roughly 24% of total wartime production. General Electric's Christmas tree lamp factory in Cleveland was retooled to produce miniature vacuum tubes. At peak production, American factories were manufacturing more than 100,000 proximity fuses per week. The fuses that cost $732 each in early 1942 cost just $18 each by 1945. That price reduction reflected both improved manufacturing efficiency and the economies of scale that only American industry could achieve. In November 1942, the Navy shipped 5,000 proximity fuses to Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet received them and began distributing them to ships operating in the Solomon Islands. But the fuses came with strict restrictions. They could only be used over open water, where dud shells would sink to the ocean floor. If a fuse failed to detonate and fell on land, Japanese engineers might recover it and reverse engineer the technology. That risk was considered unacceptable. On January 5th, 1943, those restrictions were put to the test. The light cruiser USS Helena was operating off Cape Hunter on the south coast of Guadalcanal when Japanese dive bombers attacked. After dropping their bombs, the aircraft pulled up and began climbing away. Lieutenant Red Cochran commanded Helena's aft 5-inch battery. He ordered his gun crews to fire 3 salvos with proximity-fused shells at the departing aircraft. The gun crews had minimal time to aim. The aircraft was already several thousand feet away and climbing fast. All 3 shells exploded in the air near the dive bomber. The aircraft disintegrated and fell into the ocean. Helena's crew had achieved the first confirmed kill of an enemy aircraft using a proximity-fused shell in combat. It wasn't a lucky hit. It was repeatable technology. Over the next 12 months, the effectiveness of proximity fuses in naval combat became undeniable. In 1943, Navy ships fired 9,128 proximity-fused rounds and destroyed 61 enemy aircraft. That was 1 kill for every 155 shells fired. The old time-fused shells required 508 rounds per kill. The proximity fuse was more than 3 times as effective. And this was just the beginning. As gun crews gained experience with the new fuses and fire control systems improved, the kill ratios got even better. By 1944, the number of proximity-fused rounds fired climbed to 32,826, accounting for hundreds of aircraft destroyed. During the Marianas campaign, proximity-fused 5-inch shells provided critical air defense for carrier task forces operating deep in Japanese-controlled waters. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American ships equipped with proximity fuses shot down numerous Japanese aircraft attempting to attack the carriers. The Japanese naval aviators, among the most experienced in their fleet, found themselves unable to penetrate the defensive screen created by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. One Navy study concluded that for every enemy plane destroyed, 5-inch guns had previously needed to fire approximately 1,000 time-fused shells. With proximity fuses, that number dropped to about 250 shells per kill, a fourfold improvement in effectiveness. But the true test of the proximity fuse's capabilities was still to come. By early 1945, Japan had fully committed to kamikaze tactics. Conventional bombing and torpedo attacks had proven ineffective against American naval defenses. If Japanese pilots couldn't hit American ships with bombs, they would become the bombs themselves. The kamikaze strategy was brutally simple. A plane loaded with explosives and fuel became a guided missile with a human brain controlling it. The pilot would dive his aircraft directly into an American ship, detonating on impact. One plane, one pilot. Potentially hundreds of American casualties, and a ship sunk or crippled. For the Japanese high command, the mathematics made terrible sense. They were running out of experienced pilots. They were running out of aircraft. But they still had thousands of young men willing to die for the Emperor. If each kamikaze could sink or damage even one American ship, the invasion of Japan might be delayed or stopped entirely. American ships defending Okinawa faced the full fury of this strategy. The Japanese called it kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemums. 10 massive kamikaze operations, each involving hundreds of aircraft, were launched between April and June 1945. The most dangerous assignment in the entire operation fell to the radar picket destroyers stationed 50 to 100 miles north of Okinawa. These ships served as early warning posts, detecting incoming kamikaze raids and vectoring combat air patrol fighters to intercept them. But the Japanese knew where the picket stations were. Before attacking the main fleet, kamikaze pilots were ordered to destroy the radar picket ships first, eliminate the early warning, then strike the carriers and battleships before they knew what was coming. 14 radar picket destroyers had been sunk or damaged beyond repair by early May. The life expectancy of a ship on picket duty was measured in days. On May 11, 1945, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley took station at Picket Station 15, 80 miles north of Okinawa. Her sister ship, the destroyer USS Evans, was stationed nearby for mutual support. Both ships were equipped with 5-inch guns loaded exclusively with proximity-fused ammunition. At 7:45, Hadley's radar detected the first contacts, multiple groups, approaching from multiple directions. The combat air patrol was vectored to intercept, but the Marine Corsairs were outnumbered 20 to 1. By 0800, the radar screens showed more than 150 aircraft converging on Picket Station 15. Lieutenant Commander Mullaney gave the order. All guns, commence firing at maximum effective range. Hadley's 5-inch guns opened fire at targets still 7 miles away. The proximity fuses didn't require the gunners to hit the aircraft directly. They just needed to get shells close enough for the fuses to detect the targets and detonate. The first kamikaze went down at 0803, hit by a proximity-fused shell that detonated 30 feet above it, shredding the engine and cockpit with high-velocity fragments. The pilot never knew what killed him. One moment he was diving toward the American destroyer, the next moment his aircraft was coming apart around him. The second kamikaze was hit at 0805, the third at 0807, the fourth at 0809. Hadley's gun crews worked frantically. The 5-inch guns fired as fast as the ammunition could be loaded. Shell casings piled up on the deck. The guns became so hot that paint blistered off the barrels. Smoke from continuous firing enveloped the ship. The kamikazes kept coming. Some pilots tried to approach at wave-top altitude, hoping to stay below the radar coverage, but Hadley's fire control radar could track targets down to 50 feet above the water. The proximity fuses worked just as effectively against low-altitude targets as high-altitude ones. At WWII, a kamikaze broke through the defensive fire and hit Hadley's forward stack, killing 11 men and starting fires that threatened the forward magazines. Damage control teams fought the flames while the guns kept firing. At 0820, another kamikaze hit the ship's fantail, destroying one of the 5-inch mounts and killing 9 more men. At 0825, a third kamikaze crashed into the ship amidships, causing massive flooding and a severe list to starboard. But Hadley's guns never stopped firing. The gun crews, many of them wounded, kept loading and firing proximity fuse shells, even as the ship was sinking beneath them, even as fires raged across the deck, even as kamikaze after kamikaze dove out of the sky. They kept firing. By 0920, the attack was over. Hadley was dead in the water, listing heavily, on fire, and taking water through multiple holes in her hull. But she was still afloat. Her gun crews had fired 195 proximity-fused 5-inch shells. They had shot down 23 confirmed aircraft. The nearby destroyer, Evans, had accounted for another 19 before being forced to withdraw with severe damage. Together, the two destroyers had shot down 42 kamikaze aircraft in 90 minutes of continuous combat. The after-action report was filed by Lieutenant Commander Mullaney 3 days later, after Hadley had been towed to safety. His summary was brief. Proximity fuses saved this ship. Without them, we would have been overwhelmed in the first 30 minutes. Naval analysts reviewing the engagement calculated that Hadley had achieved a hit rate of nearly 12%. 1 out of every 8 shells fired had destroyed an aircraft. With conventional time-fused ammunition, that rate would have been closer to 0.2%, or 1 aircraft destroyed for every 500 shells fired. The proximity fuse had made Hadley's guns 50 times more effective than conventional anti-aircraft fire. But what made this engagement truly remarkable wasn't just the raw numbers. It was what those numbers revealed about how completely the proximity fuse had changed the tactical situation. Before proximity fuses, a kamikaze attack on an isolated destroyer was essentially a guaranteed kill for the Japanese. A single destroyer had perhaps 6 5-inch guns. Against 50 or 100 attacking aircraft, the mathematics were impossible. Even if every gun fired continuously, even if the gunners were perfect, they couldn't shoot down enough targets to prevent multiple hits. With proximity fuses, those same 6 guns became a nearly impenetrable defensive barrier. Every shell that came within 70 feet of a target detonated automatically, creating a lethal sphere of shrapnel that aircraft couldn't avoid. The guns didn't need direct hits. They just needed to get shells into the same general airspace as the targets. This fundamentally changed the defensive equation. A destroyer on picket duty was no longer a sacrificial vessel sent out to die while providing early warning. It was a legitimate defensive platform that could survive mass kamikaze attacks through firepower alone. The Japanese had no counter to this technology. Their pilots had no way to know that American shells were detonating automatically when they came close to targets. From the pilot's perspective, it simply appeared that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. Shells exploded with perfect timing at exactly the right altitude, even when the ships were maneuvering, even when visibility was poor, even at night. There was no pattern to evade, no tactic to counter it. The American defensive fire just worked, consistently and devastatingly. What the Japanese pilots didn't know, and what their intelligence services never discovered, was that they were facing a weapon their German allies had examined and dismissed as impossible. 6 months earlier, in December 1944, German forces had overrun an American ammunition depot near Malmedy, Belgium, during the Battle of the Bulge. Inside the depot were 20,000 proximity fuses for artillery shells, intact, unused, ready for analysis. German engineers transported the fuses to laboratories in the Ruhr. They had 72 hours before Allied forces recaptured the area. In those 72 hours, they had direct access to the most advanced electronic weapon in the war. They opened the fuses. They examined the circuitry. They saw the miniature vacuum tubes, the radio transmitters and receivers, the battery systems, the safety mechanisms. They tested the components on laboratory benches, and then they filed them away as defective American equipment. The German engineers' report stated that the fuses appeared to be attempts at radio proximity devices, but they contained obvious design flaws. The vacuum tubes were too fragile to survive gunfiring. The battery system was unreliable. The antenna design was inefficient. Most critically, the fuses could not possibly work as advertised because German research had proven that vacuum tubes could not survive acceleration forces above 5,000 G-forces. Artillery shells experienced 20,000 G-forces. Therefore, the captured fuses must be either decoys designed to mislead German intelligence or failed prototypes that had never been successfully tested. The conclusion was that this was not the weapon the Allies were actually using in combat. It was filed away and forgotten. Not one of the 20,000 captured fuses was ever tested in actual firing conditions. If the Germans had loaded even a single fuse into an artillery shell and fired it at a test target, they would have seen it work. They would have understood immediately what they had captured. But they never fired one. They had already concluded proximity fuses were impossible. So when they found proximity fuses, they assumed they weren't looking at proximity fuses. This failure of imagination had consequences that rippled across both the European and Pacific theaters. In Europe, American artillery using proximity fuses devastated German infantry formations during the Battle of the Bulge. Shells that detonated 30 to 50 feet above ground rained shrapnel straight down into trenches and foxholes, killing soldiers who thought they were protected by cover. General George Patton wrote about the new ammunition in a letter to the Army's Chief of Ordnance. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. 702 confirmed German dead in a single artillery barrage. That was unprecedented lethality. But the Germans never understood what weapon was killing their troops with such efficiency. They never developed countermeasures. They never adjusted their tactics. They just kept dying in foxholes and trenches that should have protected them from conventional artillery. In the Pacific, that same German failure to recognize what they had captured meant that Japanese forces never received any intelligence warning about what they were facing. If Germany had understood the proximity fuse and shared that information with Japan, Japanese tacticians might have developed different kamikaze approaches. They might have emphasized night attacks when radar was less effective. They might have used terrain masking more aggressively. They might have coordinated attacks to overwhelm specific ships' ammunition supplies. Instead, Japanese kamikaze pilots kept flying directly into defensive fire they didn't understand, using tactics that had been rendered obsolete by technology. Their allies had examined and dismissed. The battle at Picket Station 15 on May 11th was not an isolated incident. Throughout the Okinawa campaign, American destroyers equipped with proximity fuses achieved similar results against mass kamikaze attacks. The destroyer USS Laffey was attacked by 22 kamikaze aircraft on April 16th. Her guns, firing proximity-fused ammunition exclusively, shot down 9 aircraft. 4 kamikazes hit the ship, but Laffey survived and returned to service. The destroyer USS Aaron Ward was attacked by 12 kamikazes on May 3rd. Her 5-inch guns shot down 5 before multiple aircraft crashed into the ship. Aaron Ward survived with severe damage. The destroyer USS Newcomb engaged 15 kamikazes on April 6th, shooting down 7 with proximity-fused ammunition before 3 aircraft hit the ship. The pattern was consistent across dozens of engagements. Ships with proximity fuses shot down significantly more attacking aircraft than ships with conventional ammunition. And, critically, ships with proximity fuses had much higher survival rates even when they were hit. Naval statisticians tracking the Okinawa campaign calculated that destroyers firing proximity-fused ammunition had a 70% higher probability of surviving kamikaze attacks than destroyers using conventional time-fused shells. That difference represented hundreds of American lives saved. By the end of the war, the proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the balance of power in anti-aircraft warfare. Japanese kamikaze attacks, which had been devastatingly effective in late 1944, became progressively less successful as more American ships received proximity-fused ammunition. In the final months of the war, the loss rate of American ships to air attack dropped dramatically while Japanese aircraft losses increased. The kamikaze strategy that had seemed unstoppable was being ground down by a weapon that turned near misses into kills. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands campaign in 1942 and 1943, wrote about the transformation after the war. Mechanical time fuses, which we had been using, only brought down a plane at night by accident. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft, but that was about all. The proximity fuse changed everything by making nighttime air defense genuinely effective for the first time. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was severe. They understood they were facing some kind of new defensive technology, but they couldn't determine what it was or how to counter it. Interrogations of captured Japanese pilots revealed a consistent pattern. They described American anti-aircraft fire as having become impossibly accurate. They reported that shells seemed to detonate at exactly the right moment, regardless of evasive maneuvers. Some pilots reported a fatalistic attitude, believing that if they entered the range of American ships, they would be killed before they could complete their attacks. This wasn't defeatism. It was rational assessment based on observed results. Japanese pilots watched squadron after squadron disappear into American defensive fire. The ones who survived reported that proximity to American ships meant certain death. But despite this mounting evidence, Japanese intelligence never determined how American anti-aircraft fire had become so effective. They never captured an intact proximity fuse. They never received any information from their German allies about the fuses that had been captured and dismissed in Europe. They just kept sending pilots to die against a weapon they didn't understand. Dr. Merle Tuve, the physicist who had led Section T in developing the proximity fuse, never sought recognition for his work. The project remained classified until after Japan surrendered in August 1945. Even after the war ended, Tuve rarely discussed his role publicly. When asked about the proximity fuse in interviews later in life, he emphasized the collaborative nature of the project. Thousands of people had contributed to the success: physicists, engineers, factory workers, Navy personnel. The proximity fuse wasn't the work of a single genius. It was the product of systematic collaboration across dozens of organizations. Tuve estimated that the proximity fuse had saved between 50,000 and 100,000 American lives by increasing the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire and reducing ship losses, but he never quantified it precisely because the calculation was impossible. How many ships would have been sunk without proximity fuses? How many more aircraft would have penetrated defenses? How many more sailors would have died? The counterfactual was unknowable. He just knew that ships equipped with proximity fuses shot down more attacking aircraft and suffered fewer casualties than ships without them. That was enough. Over 22 million proximity fuses were produced during World War II by more than 100 manufacturers. That scale of production required contributions from thousands of people, most of whom never knew what they were building. Women in factories across America assembled 130 components per fuse under magnifying glasses, soldering tiny connections, never told that their work was saving sailors' lives in the Pacific. They worked under armed guard, forbidden from discussing their jobs, even with family members. When the war ended and the secrecy was finally lifted, many of these workers learned for the first time what they had been building. Some cried. Some felt pride they had never felt before. They had thought they were just making radio parts. They had been protecting American ships from kamikaze attacks. One woman who had worked at the Sylvania plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, later said that for 3 years she assembled tiny components without knowing what they became. When she learned her work had protected American sailors from Japanese aircraft, she said it was the proudest moment of her life. The applied physics laboratory that Tuve founded continues to operate today as a research facility of Johns Hopkins University, conducting work in national security and advanced technology development. The building where Section T first assembled proximity fuses in 1942 no longer stands. It was demolished decades ago and replaced by commercial development. There is no memorial marker at the site. Nothing identifies it as the place where one of the war's most important technologies was born. USS Hadley was towed to safety after the battle at Picket Station 15. Her damage was too severe for repair in forward areas. She was sent back to the United States, where she remained in port for the rest of the war. Of the 320 men aboard during the kamikaze attack, 30 were killed and 67 wounded. Without proximity fuses, naval analysts calculated that Hadley would have been overwhelmed and sunk within 30 minutes of the attack beginning. All 320 men would likely have been killed. The gun crews who fired those 195 proximity fuse shells and shot down 23 attacking aircraft saved their own ship and their own lives. Most of them never knew the technical details of how the fuses worked. They just knew that the ammunition worked far better than anything they had used before. Lieutenant Commander Baron Joseph Mullaney received the Navy Cross for his actions during the engagement. His citation specifically mentioned his decision to hold fire until kamikaze aircraft were within maximum effective range of the proximity fuses, maximizing the probability of kills while conserving ammunition. The citation didn't explain what made the ammunition special. The proximity fuse remained classified for months after the war ended. Even the official records couldn't acknowledge what weapon had made Hadley's defense possible. The 42 kamikaze pilots killed attacking Picket Station 15 on May 11th were buried in military cemeteries in Japan after the war. Their graves do not mention how they died. The records list them as killed in action during kamikaze operations near Okinawa. They were among thousands of Japanese pilots who died attacking American ships in 1945, never knowing that they were facing a technology their German allies had examined 6 months earlier and thrown away as defective. They died not knowing that the shells exploding around their aircraft contained miniature radar sets more sophisticated than anything Japan had been able to build. They died not knowing that American factories were producing these shells by the hundreds of thousands, while Japanese industry struggled to manufacture basic ammunition. The German engineers who had declared proximity fuses impossible and who had examined 20,000 captured examples without recognizing what they were looking at, never understood their mistake. After the war, American technical intelligence teams interrogated German scientists and showed them the captured proximity fuses that had been filed away in warehouses. The German scientists' initial reaction was confusion. They insisted they had examined these exact fuses and determined they couldn't work. When American engineers explained that these fuses had been in combat use since January 1943 and had shot down thousands of aircraft, the German scientists were stunned. They asked to see test data. They wanted to understand how vacuum tubes could survive 20,000 G-forces when their own calculations had proven it was impossible. American engineers showed them the reinforced tube designs, the shock mounting systems, the quality control processes. The German scientists understood immediately what they had missed. It wasn't a difference in theoretical knowledge. Both sides had understood the physics. The difference was in execution, in manufacturing capability, in the willingness to iterate through failure until the design worked. German industry in 1944 simply didn't have the capacity to produce miniature ruggedized vacuum tubes in quantities of millions while maintaining the quality control necessary for 90% reliability. Even if German engineers had recognized what they were looking at when they examined the captured fuses, they couldn't have replicated the technology before the war ended. But that didn't change the fundamental reality of their failure. They had held the answer in their hands and declared it impossible because it violated their assumptions about what could be built. Vannevar Bush, who oversaw the entire American scientific research effort during the war, called the proximity fuse one of the three most important developments of World War II, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But unlike the atomic bomb, which became famous immediately after Hiroshima, or radar, which was publicly acknowledged during the war, the proximity fuse remained obscure for decades. The technology stayed classified long after the war ended because proximity fuses continued to be used in new weapon systems. When the full story finally became public in the 1970s and 80s, most of the people involved were dead or elderly. Tuve had died in 1982. Most of the Section T engineers and scientists had passed away. The women who had assembled the fuses in factories were scattered across the country. The soldiers and sailors whose lives had been saved by proximity fuses rarely knew the technical details of how the technology worked. They just knew that anti-aircraft guns had suddenly become far more effective and that ships equipped with the new ammunition survived attacks that would have sunk them before. The technology remained mysterious, even to the people whose lives it saved. This is how wars are actually won, not through dramatic breakthroughs or genius inventors working in isolation, but through systematic collaboration between scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and military personnel who refuse to accept that critical problems cannot be solved. The proximity fuse succeeded because Merle Tuve and his team at Section T wouldn't accept the conclusion that building miniature ruggedized vacuum tubes was impossible. It succeeded because engineers at Western Electric and Raytheon iterated through hundreds of failed designs until they found one that worked. It succeeded because factory workers across America assembled 130 components per fuse with precision and care, never knowing what they were building, but understanding it was important. It succeeded because the United States had the industrial capacity to produce 22 million complex electronic devices while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and every other weapon of modern warfare. And it succeeded because Lieutenant Commander Baron Joseph Mullaney and thousands of other officers made the decision to trust the technology when their lives depended on it, firing proximity-fused shells at attacking aircraft even when they didn't fully understand how the weapons worked. The story of the proximity fuse is the story of what becomes possible when brilliant people are given clear objectives, adequate resources, and freedom to solve problems without bureaucratic constraints. It's the story of innovation that happens through systematic problem-solving at scale, not individual genius. And it's the story of a weapon that saved tens of thousands of Allied lives and changed naval warfare forever. Developed by people whose names are mostly forgotten today, used by sailors who never knew the technical details, and dismissed as impossible by enemies who held working examples in their hands and couldn't see what they were looking at. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.